Every con needs a light source, and the best ones never use a spotlight, they use a sunset. This is the story of a man who spent 35 years learning to spot a bad foundation before the cracks ever showed, and still walks straight into the oldest structure there is, one built entirely out of family. He checked the paperwork. He checked the ID. What he never thought to check was the bloodline standing behind both of them. I spent 35 years as a building contractor in Boise, Idaho, most of it running my own crew, and if there's one thing that trade teaches you, it's that everything looks fine from the street. You can dress up a house with new siding and a fresh coat of trim paint, and it'll photograph beautifully, and none of that tells you whether the sill plate underneath is rotted through or the electrical was done by somebody's brother-in-law who watched a couple videos online. I built a career on not trusting the photograph. I trusted the inspection. I want that on the record early, because it's going to matter later, and because it's the reason this story stings in a particular way most stories like it don't. I learned that lesson the hard way early in my career, back when I was still subcontracting for a bigger outfit in my late 20s, on a remodel where the previous owner had painted straight over water damage in the basement, instead of fixing it, and I signed off on the walkthrough without pulling back a single panel to check, because everything looked fresh and clean, and the seller seemed like a straight shooter. Cost my boss at the time nearly $11,000 in mold remediation once the new owners found it, and cost me a stern lecture I never forgot. Always pull the panel, he told me. Doesn't matter how good the paint job looks, you pull the panel or you don't sign anything. I built the rest of my career on that one sentence, and I genuinely believed, right up until Palawan, that I'd never once forgotten it. I sold my share of the business at 58, kept a small consulting arrangement for old clients who wanted a second opinion before they signed a contract, and found myself, 18 months later, with more free time than I'd had since I was 19 years old. My wife Carol and I had split 9 years earlier, no big blow-up, just two people who'd grown into different lives under the same roof, comfortable enough with each other by the end that we still spoke most Christmases. Our son Tyler was 31, married, living in Denver, doing fine without needing his old man underfoot. I'd been to the Philippines twice before on vacation, once with a buddy from the trade, and something about it had stuck with me in a way vacations usually don't. The pace of it, the warmth of people who had far less than we did back home, and seemed, somehow, less anxious about it. When the consulting work slowed down, I booked a longer trip to Palawan, told myself it was just to see if I could stand 6 months somewhere quiet, and ended up staying most of 2 years. I met Pearl at a beach bar outside Puerto Princesa, the kind of place with plastic chairs and a guy playing acoustic covers a little too loud for the size of the crowd, the ocean just visible past the string lights strung between two coconut posts. She was 30, worked in event coordination for a tour company, organizing island-hopping trips and the occasional wedding for foreign couples who wanted a Palawan ceremony. She had a way of talking about her work that reminded me of how I used to talk about a job site, this specific, practical pride in getting the logistics right, boat schedules, permit paperwork, keeping 40 impatient tourists happy on a schedule that could fall apart with one broken engine, and I liked that about her immediately. We ended up at the same table for most of the evening, trading stories, her laughing at my attempts to pronounce local place names, me laughing at how patiently she corrected me each time, and by the time I walked back to my rental that night, I'd already decided I wanted to see her again, which wasn't something I'd decided about anybody in a long time. I want to be fair to those first few months, because they were good, genuinely good, not the manufactured kind of good I'd later have reason to question. Pearl introduced me to her work, took me along on a couple of the island tours she was coordinating, and I got to see her handle problems in real time. A broken outrigger motor, a confused group of German tourists arguing about snorkel fees, a boat captain running 40 minutes late, while a client threatened to demand a refund, all of it managed with the same calm competence I respected in a good foreman who never raised his voice on a chaotic job site. She asked good questions about my old business, seemed genuinely interested in how a house actually gets built, rather than just making polite conversation about it, once spending a full evening asking me to explain load-bearing walls with a napkin and a pen, And there were evenings, plenty of them, where I forgot entirely that I was 60 years old and a long way from Boise, and just felt like a man who'd gotten lucky twice in one lifetime. We settled into a rhythm over those months that felt, at the time, like the most natural thing in the world. Dinners most nights, weekends spent exploring different parts of the island, long conversations on my rented balcony about nothing in particular, the kind of easy talk two people fall into once the performance of a new relationship starts wearing off, and something steadier takes its place. She met a few of the other expats I'd gotten to know, was polite and pleasant with all of them, and I remember one of them, an older Brit named Percival, telling me over beers that she seemed like a keeper, real, not one of the types he'd seen chew through foreign retirees on this stretch of coast. I took real comfort in hearing that from someone outside my own head, someone with no stake in whether I was right or wrong about her. Percival himself had been out here almost 15 years, married to a local woman, genuinely happy by every measure I could see, and his approval mattered to me more than I probably let on at the time, a kind of second-hand due diligence I didn't even realize I was leaning on until much later, when I understood exactly how limited even a good man's outside view could be. The land came up around month 5, and it came up the way most good pitches do, sideways, almost by accident. Pearl mentioned she had a family friend, a quiet man named Dodong, who owned a lot outside the city he'd been thinking about selling. 2,000 square meters, mango trees on it, close enough to catch a glimpse of the sea from the high corner. She said it almost as an aside, over dinner, not pushing anything, just mentioning that if I was ever serious about building something here, this was the kind of parcel that didn't come up often. I'll admit my interest caught fast. I'd spent 35 years building other people's houses. The idea of finally building my own, somewhere warm, somewhere I actually wanted to live out the rest of my life, had a pull to it I didn't examine as closely as I should have. She took me to see it on a Thursday evening, timed, I understood much later, with real precision. Golden hour, the light coming in low and orange through the mango trees, the grass gone that particular soft gold color it only holds for about 20 minutes before dusk swallows it. Pearl walked me across the lot, pointing out the boundaries, the slight rise where a house would sit nicely above any flooding, the exact spot where you could just catch a strip of blue water in the gap between two hills. Imagine a porch right here, Wesley, facing that view. You could watch the sunset every night of your life from this spot. I stood there taking it in, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, not since I'd walked my own first job site as a young man, with nothing but a truck and a toolbox, and an idea of what I wanted my life to look like. I took a photo on my phone, the two of us standing at the edge of the property with that light behind us, and I remember thinking, clear as anything, I could build something real here. I still have that photo. I'll get to why in a minute. Dodong met us there that same evening, a quiet, unhurried man in his 40s, work boots, hands that had clearly done real labor at some point in his life, which I noted approvingly, the way one tradesman notices another, across a job site he's never worked before. He didn't oversell anything. If anything, he undersold it, mentioning a drainage issue on the low corner that would need addressing, pointing out a boundary marker that had shifted slightly and would need a proper resurvey before any construction started, even walking me over to show me exactly where the old marker stone sat half buried in the grass. Better you know now, before you build, he said, in careful, unhurried English, and I remember shaking his hand afterward, thinking I'd finally found the rarest thing in any market anywhere in the world, a straight-dealing seller. I liked him for that. In my line of work, the sellers who tell you the bad news up front are almost always the ones you can trust, because a con artist oversells, and a straight dealer just tells you what you're actually buying. I filed Dodong away, mentally, as one of the good ones. That instinct, so reliable across 35 years of job sites back home, turned out to be exactly the wrong tool for this particular job. The price was $85,000, and I remember doing rough math in my head standing right there on the lot, comparing it against what I'd heard beachfront-adjacent land was going for elsewhere on the island. It struck me, honestly, as almost too good. the kind of price that should have made me more suspicious rather than less. And I want to be honest that it did cross my mind, briefly, before Pearl explained that Da Nong needed the money relatively quickly for a family matter back in his home province, and wasn't interested in dragging out negotiations with multiple buyers. He just wanted a fair, fast sale to someone he trusted. Pearl vouching for him settled the question in my mind almost entirely. I'd have wanted more from a stranger. I wanted less from a woman I was falling in love with. I did what I genuinely believed, at the time, was real diligence. The same kind of check I'd have run on a subcontractor bidding a job back in Boise, walking through every step methodically the way I'd trained myself to over 3.5 decades in the trade. I had a local fixer, a guy Pearl connected me with named Rico, who did paperwork runs for expats, pull the title from the registry to confirm it existed, and match Dodong's name. It did. I checked Dodong's government ID against the name on the title. It matched. I even paid a modest fee for a basic title search to confirm there were no existing liens or competing claims registered against the property. Clean. I went one step further than most buyers probably would have, insisting Rico walk the boundary lines with me in person, comparing what we found on the ground against the technical description on the title itself, pacing off distances with a measuring wheel I'd brought from home out of pure habit, the same wheel I'd used on hundreds of job sites back in Idaho. Every box I knew to check, I checked, and every box came back green. I remember feeling almost smug about it actually, telling myself I was being the careful, methodical buyer that most foreigners apparently weren't. The guy who did his homework instead of getting swept up in a beautiful sunset and a beautiful woman. The kind of buyer who'd have caught the mold behind that basement wall 30 years earlier, if he'd been the one running the walkthrough instead of his younger, greener self. What I didn't check, because it never occurred to me that it was a category of thing you needed to check, was who Dodong actually was to Pearl. Family friend, she'd said, and I took that at face value, the same way I'd have taken a subcontractor's word that he was licensed, without demanding to see the license itself, because you don't run a background check on every adjective a person uses to describe their own relationships. It didn't occur to me, not once across the entire negotiation, to ask directly whether they were related, and it certainly didn't occur to me to ask how recently Dodong himself had acquired the land, or what he'd paid for it. Those aren't questions that show up on a title search. They're not questions that show up anywhere, unless you already know to distrust the story you're being told, and I didn't, because the story was being told by someone I loved. The land was placed in Pearl's name, not mine, which she explained early, and reasonably enough, foreigners can't directly own land in the Philippines, a restriction I already understood, from my own reading before I'd ever set foot on that lot. It's normal, Wesley. This is how every foreigner does it here. It will be ours, for when we marry, I promise you. I remember nodding along to that explanation, the way you nod along to a building code you don't love, but understand exists for a reason. It made sense on paper. It made sense out loud, spoken in a voice I trusted completely. I transferred the full $85,000 in 3 installments over about 6 weeks, the way Dodong's people requested it, and I remember each transfer feeling less like a risk and more like a foundation being poured, each one solidifying something I believed was going to be the last chapter of my working life. For a while after the purchase, everything continued much as it had before, maybe even better, because now we had a shared project, a shared future to talk about over dinner. We picked out rough sketches for a house together, argued cheerfully about roof pitch and whether a wraparound porch made sense in that climate, the kind of argument that felt, at the time, like the healthiest thing in the world, 2 people building something side by side. I hired a local architect, a soft-spoken young man named Ferdy, who'd trained in Manila and had real skill, and the 3 of us spent whole evenings with sketches spread across my kitchen table, Pearl weighing in on kitchen placement with genuine opinions, arguing that a proper Filipino kitchen needed its own separate space away from the main living area for the heavier cooking smells, a detail I'd never have thought of on my own, and appreciated for exactly that reason. I paid a surveyor to confirm the boundary lines Dodong had pointed out, and slowly, over about 4 months, A version of my retirement I'd never quite let myself imagine, started to feel real and close and mine. I called Tyler a few times that spring, just to talk through the house plans with him, the way I used to run ideas past him on smaller projects when he was a teenager, tagging along on job sites during summer break, sending him photos of Ferdy's sketches, and asking what he thought of the layout, whether the second bedroom felt big enough, whether he and his wife might actually visit once it was built. He seemed happy for me, genuinely, though I remember one call where he asked, carefully, how well I actually knew Pearl's family, and I brushed the question off lightly, told him I'd met her mother twice already, lovely woman, nothing to worry about. I think back on that conversation often now, how easily I deflected a perfectly reasonable question from my own son. The same kind of question I'd have insisted any client of mine ask before signing off on a contractor they'd known less than a year. And how strange it is that a man can spend his whole career teaching other people to ask hard questions and still manage to dodge the one his own kid puts to him over the phone. I did meet her mother twice, and I want to be fair and say those 2 dinners were pleasant, unremarkable, the kind of meal where an older woman fusses over whether her daughter's American boyfriend is eating enough rice, and asks polite, careful questions about Idaho winters, whether the snow really came up past a man's knees the way she'd seen in movies. Nothing in either dinner raised a flag for me at the time, no strange undercurrent, no awkward silence when Dodong's name came up in passing once, mentioned by Pearl's mother herself as, your kind seller, we're lucky to know him. I've replayed that particular sentence more than once since, wondering whether it was an accidental slip, or simply confident enough in my ignorance that it didn't need to be careful at all. The first thing that didn't sit right came almost by accident, the way these things usually do. I was having a beer with another American expat I'd gotten to know, a retired airline mechanic named Ellis, who'd been in Palawan almost a decade, and knew the local land market better than most agents. A heavy-set, plain-spoken man who'd fixed engines his whole career and had the same instinct I did for spotting a part that had been swapped out without proper documentation. I mentioned the lot, mostly making conversation, not looking for advice, describing the mango trees and the view Pearl had shown me that first evening. Ellis asked, casually, who the seller had been. I told him. Dodong. Ellis went quiet for a second, the particular quiet of a man deciding whether to say something he knows will land badly, turning his bottle slowly on the table before he spoke again, the acoustic guitar from the next table over, filling the silence for a moment, before he found his words. You know that's Pearl's cousin, right? Her mom sighed. Everybody around the tour company office knows that family. They've moved a couple of lots like that before. Always through somebody's boyfriend. I remember the sentence landing somewhere in my chest, physically, the way a bad inspection report lands when you've already told the client the house is solid. I didn't say anything to Pearl that night. I want to be honest about why. Because it matters. It wasn't strategy. I genuinely didn't know what to do with the information yet, and some stubborn part of me needed to believe there was an innocent explanation. That a family connection wasn't automatically a crime. That plenty of people buy land through relatives without anything crooked going on at all. I told myself that, over and over, lying awake that night doing the kind of mental cross-checking I used to do on a disputed change order, trying to find the version of events where everyone had acted in good faith, running the numbers on how a distant cousin selling land at a fair market rate was a completely ordinary, unremarkable thing that happened every day in every country in the world. I brought it up carefully a few days later, over breakfast, trying to keep my tone light, curious rather than accusing, the coffee going cold in front of me, while I worked up to the question. Somebody mentioned Dodong's your cousin. Is that right? Pearl's face did something quick and complicated, there and gone almost before I could read it, and then she said, evenly, setting her own cup down carefully, yes, distant cousin, my mother's side. Does that matter? I told you he was someone I trusted. I said it mattered a little, that I wished I'd known up front, not because family sellers were automatically dishonest, but because it changed how I should have thought about the price and the process. She looked genuinely hurt by that, which threw me more than anger would have. her eyes actually welling up in a way that made me feel, for a horrible second, like I'd accused her of something monstrous rather than asked a reasonable question. You think I would cheat you, Wesley? My own family? This is insulting. I backed off. I apologized, for asking a reasonable question about a transaction involving my own life savings, and I've had a long time since to sit with how upside down that moment was. The second thing came about 2 months later, and this one I found entirely by accident. The kind of accident that only happens because you've started, without fully admitting it to yourself, looking harder than you used to. I was helping Rico, my fixer, track down an unrelated document for the house permit application, sitting across from him at a small table in the registry office annex, while he flipped through a folder of records, and while we were waiting for a clerk he mentioned, offhand, that he'd pulled Dodong's prior deed of sale months earlier as part of the original title check, back when I'd first asked him to verify everything, and that the record showed Dodong had acquired the lot himself, less than a year before selling it to me. I asked how much he'd paid. Rico didn't know exactly. That detail wasn't part of what he'd been asked to check originally, but he thought he could find the transfer tax records, which are public, and pull the declared value, if I wanted him to run it down properly. It took him 3 days to get back to me, and when he did, he sent the figure over text with no commentary attached, the way you'd forward a subcontractor's actual material costs after you'd already paid full retail for the same job. $19,000. 8 months before I paid $85,000 for the exact same lot, the family had acquired it for $19,000. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after reading that number, doing the kind of math I used to do on a bad bid, the gap between what something actually costs and what somebody's willing to pay for it when they don't know any better. Except this time, I was the one on the wrong side of the spread, and the markup wasn't covering materials or labor. It was covering nothing at all except the distance between what I knew and what they'd let me know. I remember sitting on my balcony that evening, with the number just sitting there on my phone screen, staring out at a view I'd stopped being able to enjoy the way I had, even an hour earlier. I confronted Pearl with it that weekend, laid the numbers out on the kitchen table the way I'd have laid out a disputed invoice. Calm, methodical, wanting an explanation more than a fight. Ferdy's house sketches, still sitting in a folder at the edge of the same table, where I set the printed transfer records down beside my untouched cup of coffee. She looked at the numbers for a long moment, and her face went through something I hadn't seen from her before. Not quite guilt, something closer to resignation, like a person watching a plan they'd known was fragile finally give way. Land value goes up fast here, Wesley. You know this. 8 months is a long time in this market. I told her I'd spent 35 years pricing construction and land both, and nothing about the local market had moved 450% in 8 months. That number wasn't appreciation, it was a markup with my name attached to the invoice. She didn't have an answer for that. She just sat there, quiet, and for the first time since I'd met her, I watched her run out of a story to tell me. I asked her directly, finally, whether the whole thing had been planned before I ever saw that lot at Golden Hour, whether Dodong had bought it specifically because there was a foreigner in the picture who might buy it back at a markup, whether the drainage issue he'd pointed out so honestly had been a piece of theater designed to make him look trustworthy, rather than the genuinely helpful disclosure I'd taken it for. She didn't answer that one directly either. What she said instead has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this whole story. You wanted to believe it was real, Wesley. I didn't lie about everything. The land is real. The mango trees are real. You're the one who decided the rest. I've turned that sentence over more times than I can count since, because there's something almost unbearably honest buried inside a defense that was, at its core, still a justification for taking $85,000 off a man who trusted her. I pushed a little further that same evening, unable to leave it alone, asking whether her mother had known, whether the whole family had sat around some kitchen table, discussing the plan the way Ferdy and I had sat around mine, discussing roof pitches, comparing notes on which buyer might bite and how quickly. She went quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, Her voice had lost the defensive edge it usually carried during these conversations, replaced by something flatter, more tired. My mother has done this before, yes. Not with me before you. With my older sister's husband, years ago, a different lot, a different foreigner who never quite understood what happened to him either. It's how some families survive here, Wesley. You don't understand what it's like to have nothing, and then to see a way. I sat with that for a long time afterward, turning over the uncomfortable, complicated truth buried inside it, that desperation and deception aren't always separate things, that a family surviving on very little might reach for whatever tools were available to them, even tools that hollowed out a man on the other end of the transaction, a man who'd once been just as poor himself, decades earlier, before 35 years of steady work had built him something solid. I didn't excuse it, I still don't. But I stopped, somewhere around that conversation, needing her to be purely a villain in order for my own grief to make sense. The relationship didn't end in one dramatic scene, the way I might have expected if you'd asked me beforehand how a thing like this would play out. It ended slowly, over the following 2 months, in a series of smaller withdrawals that mirrored, almost exactly, the way the whole thing had been built up in the first place. She stopped bringing up the house plans. Ferdy stopped hearing from her when I'd ask her to follow up on revisions, and eventually just started coming to me directly, quietly asking whether he should keep the project active or shelve it, a question I didn't have a real answer for. Dodong, whom I'd started to think of as something between a business acquaintance and a future in-law, simply stopped appearing in conversation at all, as though he'd never existed as anything more than a prop for a single golden hour evening. I finally asked Pearl, straight out, sitting on that same balcony where we used to talk for hours, whether we were still building a life together, or whether I should start thinking about the $85,000 as something I'd simply lost. She didn't answer with words. She answered by not answering, 3 separate times, across 3 separate conversations, until the not answering became the answer itself. I hired a proper attorney after that, not Rico, someone recommended by another expat with real legal standing, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Corazon, who'd handled foreign investment disputes for over a decade, to see what options I actually had. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, took notes on a yellow legal pad the old-fashioned way, occasionally stopping me to ask a clarifying question about dates or amounts with the same precision I'd have expected from a good project manager reviewing a change order, and then laid out the situation for me as plainly as I'd have laid out a bad foundation report to a homeowner who didn't want to hear it. The answer was about what I'd feared going in. The land sat in Pearl's name, entirely legal under the ownership restrictions I'd understood from the start, and without a marriage or a formal documented loan agreement establishing my financial interest, I had no enforceable claim to the property itself. Only, potentially, a difficult and expensive case for fraud or unjust enrichment that she rated as a long, costly fight with uncertain odds. Corazon didn't sugarcoat it. "I've seen this exact pattern before, Mr. Grimshaw," she told me, not unkindly, closing her legal pad with a soft, final sound. "More than you'd think. I didn't have the stomach for a multi-year fight. I'd already spent enough on that lot. The land, I later learned through Ellis, who still had ears in the tour company office, was quietly resold within about 4 months of Pearl and me splitting, to another buyer nobody in that circle seemed to know much about. Ellis heard it secondhand, from a mutual acquaintance who worked in the registry office part-time, doing filing work, the kind of low-level job that happens to put a person in the exact right place to notice a familiar name crossing a desk twice in under a year. I don't know what the new buyer paid. I don't know if he was a foreigner, or whether he stood in that same spot at golden hour, with the same mango trees behind him, and the same feeling I'd had, that particular, specific feeling of a life finally coming together in front of you. A feeling I now know how to name precisely, but couldn't have named at the time for anything in the world. I hope, if he was, that somebody warned him. I doubt anybody did, because nobody warned me, and I'd spent 35 years thinking I was too careful a man to need warning. I flew home to Boise about 6 weeks after Corazon gave me her final assessment, Not in a rush, not running from anything exactly, just no longer able to justify staying somewhere that had cost me more than money. I sold off most of what I'd accumulated during those 2 years, gave away furniture to a couple of the other expats I'd befriended, including Percival, who took the news harder than I expected, shaking his head slowly and saying only, "I really thought that one was different, Wesley. I'm sorry," and left with 2 suitcases and a folder of paperwork Corazon had advised me to keep, in case anything ever developed on the legal side down the road, which, as of this telling, it never has. Tyler picked me up from the airport, and somewhere on the drive back to his place I told him the whole thing, start to finish, the golden hour, the title check, the $19,000, Pearl's line about her mother and her older sister's husband, all of it. He was quiet behind the wheel for a while, both hands steady on the wheel the way I'd taught him to drive years earlier, and then he said something that's stuck with me since, the kind of thing a son says to a father that lands harder than it would from anybody else. "Dad, you always taught me you can inspect a house all day long. You can't inspect a person's family." I didn't have anything to say back to that. I just nodded and looked out the window at a state I'd forgotten how flat it was, mile after mile of Idaho farmland rolling past, about as far from a Palawan sunset as a place could get. I don't hate Pearl, and that's taken me a long time to be able to say honestly, rather than as some kind of performance of maturity. I think there was a version of her that genuinely enjoyed those early months, the tour logistics, the house sketches, the roof pitch arguments, the evening with Ferdy's napkin sketches spread across my kitchen table, the 2 dinners with her mother where nothing seemed remotely amiss, and I think there was another version of her, shaped by a family that had likely run some version of this play before I ever walked into that beach bar, that understood exactly how to fold real affection around a financial architecture designed to move money in one direction only. I don't think those 2 versions were separate people. I think, like a lot of the flawed buildings I spent 35 years fixing, she was one structure with a foundation that had been poured wrong a long time before I ever arrived to inspect it, and no amount of good trim work on top of it was ever going to change what was underneath. I still have that photo, the one from the first evening, the 2 of us at the edge of the lot with that light behind us, gold and soft and completely real. People ask me sometimes why I've kept it, given everything, and the honest answer is that it's the only piece of evidence I have that at least one part of the whole story wasn't manufactured. The light really was that beautiful. The mango trees really were there. For 20 minutes on a Thursday evening in Palawan, I stood on a piece of ground I genuinely believed was going to be the last home I ever built, and some part of that feeling, whatever else turned out to be false around it, was mine, honestly earned, and I've decided, after a lot of long nights turning this whole thing over, that I'm allowed to keep it without that meaning I've forgiven the $85,000, or forgotten how carefully I checked every single piece of paper except the one relationship that actually mattered. I still take the occasional consulting job back in Boise, walking through half-built houses with new clients, checking the bones of things before anyone signs off on the finished work, and I've found myself, more than once, standing in some stranger's unfinished kitchen, thinking about that lot outside Puerto Princesa, the mango trees, the view of the sea from the high corner, wondering what it would have looked like finished, whether the porch would have faced the water the way Pearl once promised it would from that exact spot. It's a strange kind of grief, mourning a house that never existed, built entirely out of sketches and golden light. But I've stopped pretending it isn't real grief, just because nothing was ever actually built. I've started telling a version of this story to a few of my newer clients, the ones heading overseas for retirement, the ones with that particular look in their eye I recognize, because I used to have it myself, usually somewhere in their late 50s or early 60s, standing in a half-framed house talking about somewhere warm they're planning to end up eventually. I think about that drainage issue Dodong pointed out, so honestly that first evening, more than almost anything else from those 2 years, how a single true, useful piece of information, freely given, can do more to earn a stranger's trust than any amount of glowing promises, and how a good con doesn't need to lie about everything. It only needs to be right about one small, verifiable thing to make you stop checking the rest. I tell them the same thing every time. You can hire the best inspector in the world, and he'll tell you everything about the studs and the wiring and the foundation. He can't tell you a single thing about who's standing behind the cellar, smiling, holding your hand, walking you toward the light at exactly the right hour of the day. That part, I tell them, you have to learn to check yourself, and God willing, it costs you less than it cost me to learn it.